In the sleepy village of Chipping Barrows, where secrets lurk behind lace curtains, a scandal erupts at Rose Cottage. Mrs. Evelyn Carver sacks her loyal housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, accusing her of betrayal over private letters. But when Mrs. Finch vanishes and a scream pierces the night, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, begins to unravel a web of deceit. A mysterious artist, shadowy figures, and a hidden past threaten to unravel the village's peace. Will Miss Marple uncover the truth before the curtains close on a deadly secret? Dive into a tale of suspicion, betrayal, and cunning in this classic mystery. Chapter 1. The Village of Chipping Barrows. The village of Chipping Barrows lay cradled in a gentle hollow of the English countryside, its stone cottages and winding lanes bathed in the golden haze of an October morning. Ivy twined over garden walls, and the air carried the faint sweetness of late roses mingling with wood smoke. It was a place where time seemed to pause, where the rhythm of life was marked by the church bell's chime and the daily chatter at the post office. Yet beneath its tranquil surface, Chipping Barrows thrived on the quiet currents of gossip, speculation, and secrets that Miss Jane Marple, with her unassuming air and needle-sharp mind, had a knack for uncovering. Miss Marple sat in her small, sunlit drawing-room at Lavender Cottage, her knitting needles moving with a soft, rhythmic click. A skein of pale blue wool rested in her lap, destined to become a scarf for her nephew Raymond's youngest. The room was a picture of comfort. Chintz curtains, a well-polished mahogany table, and a vase of Michaelmas daisies glowing in the light. But Miss Marple's thoughts were far from the cozy scene. Her eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, flickered toward the window, where the village stirred with its usual morning bustle. Her maid, Lily, burst in with a clatter of teacups, her round face alight with the kind of excitement that only fresh scandal could ignite. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll never believe what's happened," she exclaimed, setting the tray down with a thud that made the teaspoons rattle. "There's been an awful to-do at Rose Cottage. Mrs. Evelyn Carver's gone and sacked Mrs. Finch, her housekeeper, right there in the front garden for all to see, shouting about betrayal and heaven knows what. Mrs. Phipps from the bakery saw it all, says Mrs. Carver was red as a beet, waving her arms like a windmill." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity tinged with something keener. "Betrayal, you say, Lily?" Her voice was gentle, almost absent-minded, but her mind was already at work, sifting through the names and faces of Chipping Barrows. Mrs. Evelyn Carver, a widow of some 50 years, was a woman of considerable means and even more considerable pride. Her sharp tongue was legendary, capable of cutting through village pleasantries like a knife through butter. Mrs. Finch, by contrast, was a model of quiet efficiency, a woman who had kept Rose Cottage spotless for a decade with never a whisper of discontent. To sack her so publicly, and with such an accusation, was extraordinary. "How very distressing," Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea from the pot with a steady hand. "And what did Mrs. Finch do, I wonder, to provoke such a scene?" Lily, eager to share every morsel, leaned closer. "Mrs. Phipps says Mrs. Finch just stood there, white as a sheet, clutching her apron. Didn't say a word, just turned and walked off toward her own cottage. But Mrs. Carver was shouting about private papers and disloyalty. Oh, it's the talk of the village, Miss Marple. Mr. Bailey at the grocer's says he's not surprised. Says Mrs. Finch has been acting odd these past weeks, always looking over her shoulder like she expected someone to jump out at her." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Odd, you say? In what way, Lily?" "Well," Lily said, warming to her tale, "she's been asking questions, hasn't she? Tom Reed, the grocer's boy, told me she kept pestering him about strangers in the village or folks acting out of sorts, like she was afraid of something. And then there's that artist fellow, Mr. Redding, always hanging about Rose Cottage with his sketchbook. Mrs. Phipps thinks he's up to no good. But then she thinks that about anyone new. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to the village's newest resident, Lawrence Redding, a painter who had taken lodgings at the Blue Boar a month ago. His arrival had caused a stir among the younger women, with his easy charm and dark, brooding eyes. But Miss Marple had noted a certain guardedness in his manner, a tendency to deflect questions with a smile. And now, Mrs. Finch's sudden dismissal, and her apparent unease connected, perhaps? The threads of the puzzle were faint, but they were there, waiting to be gathered. She set her teacup down and resumed her knitting, though her mind was far from the scarf. "Thank you, Lily," she said with a smile. "You've been most informative. Perhaps I'll take a walk to Rose Cottage this afternoon. I believe I owe Mrs. Carver a jar of my damson jam." Lily beamed, oblivious to the quiet machinery of Miss Marple's thoughts. As the maid bustled out, Miss Marple gazed out the window, where the village went about its day, unaware of the shadows stirring behind its cottage curtains. Something was amiss in Chipping Barrows, and she intended to find out what. Chapter 2. The cottage in question. The autumn sun hung low over Chipping Barrows, casting long shadows across the lanes as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward Rose Cottage. Her steps were measured, her black umbrella tapping the ground like a metronome, though her eyes bright and watchful missed nothing. The village was abuzz with the morning scandal, and Miss Marple, under the guise of delivering a jar of her homemade damson jam, intended to see for herself the stage where this curious drama had unfolded. Rose Cottage, perched at the edge of the village where the road dipped toward the meadows, was a charming picture. Its stone walls glowed warmly in the sunlight, and its garden burst with the fiery hues of late chrysanthemums and dahlias. Yet, to Miss Marple's discerning eye, there was something amiss, a faint air of neglect, perhaps in the unweeded flower beds or the curtains drawn just a fraction too tightly. Mrs. Evelyn Carver received her in the parlor, a room that once sparkled under Mrs. Finch's care, but now seemed dim, its air heavy with the scent of lavender polish and unspoken tension. Mrs. Carver, a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and hair still dark despite her 50 years, sat rigidly on a brocade chair, her hands twisting the pearl brooch pinned to her blouse. Her face was pale, her lips pressed thin, but her eyes burned with a mix of indignation and unease. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped, "how kind of you to call. I suppose you've heard the talk. The village can't seem to mind its own business." Miss Marple smiled, settling herself on the edge of a chintz-covered sofa, the jar of jam placed delicately on the table between them. "My dear Mrs. Carver, villages are like that, aren't they? A little excitement, and everyone's tongue wags. But I was so sorry to hear of your trouble with Mrs. Finch. Such a shock, after all these years." Mrs. Carver's mouth tightened further, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "A shock? It was a betrayal, Miss Marple. That woman 10 years in my employ, and I find her rummaging through my desk. Private papers, letters of a personal nature. I caught her red-handed, as she had the gall to claim she was looking for a recipe I'd asked for. A recipe? As if I'd believe such nonsense." Miss Marple's expression remained one of gentle concern, though her mind was already sorting the details like cards in a game of patience. "How very distressing," she said, her tone soothing. "And what did she say when you confronted her?" "Nothing worth repeating," Mrs. Carver snapped, her fingers tightening on the brooch until her knuckles whitened. Mumbled excuses, then silence. "I told her to pack her things and leave at once. I won't have disloyalty in my house." She paused, her gaze flickering to the window, where the curtains hung still, shutting out the world. She'd been acting strange for weeks, you know. Sneaking about, whispering with that grocer's boy, Tom Reed, when he made deliveries. "I wouldn't be surprised if they were in league together." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes noting the faint layer of dust on the mantelpiece, a stark contrast to the pristine order Mrs. Finch had always maintained. The room felt oddly hollow, as if the heart of the house had been removed with its housekeeper's departure. Tom Reed, you say? She mused, her voice light. A talkative lad, I've found. Perhaps he knows something of Mrs. Finch's state of mind. Mrs. Carver gave a short, bitter laugh. State of mind? She's a schemer, Miss Marple, mark my words. I've half a mind to check my silver, though nothing seems missing yet. She rose abruptly, as if to signal the visit's end, but Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drifting to a small writing desk in the corner. Its polished surface bore a faint smudge, as if fingers had recently fumbled with its lock. Those letters, Miss Marple ventured, her tone as soft as a breeze. They must have been very private indeed to cause such a stir. Not business matters, I presume? Mrs. Carver froze, her hand hovering over the teapot she'd begun to fuss with. For a moment her composure faltered, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of something fear, perhaps, or guilt, before the mask snapped back into place. Personal correspondence, she said curtly. Nothing that concerns anyone else. Now, if you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have matters to attend to. Miss Marple rose, her smile unruffled. Of course, my dear. I shan't keep you. Thank you for the chat, and do let me know if you need another jar of jam. As she stepped into the garden, she paused to admire the chrysanthemums, though her eyes strayed to the windows, where the curtains remained firmly drawn. A faint creak from within the house caught her ear a floorboard, perhaps, or a door easing shut. Mrs. Carver lived alone now, with no staff to account for such sounds. Miss Marple filed this away, her curiosity sharpening like a blade. As she walked back through the village, the high street hummed with its usual rhythm. The butcher's boy whistling, the postmistress sorting letters, and Mrs. Phipps from the bakery exchanging whispers with a customer. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were elsewhere. Mrs. Carver's vehemence suggested more than a simple breach of trust. Those letters, so fiercely guarded, hinted at a secret worth protecting, a secret Mrs. Finch had stumbled upon, perhaps unwittingly. And Tom Reed, with his easy access to Rose Cottage, might know more than he realized. Miss Marple recalled a similar incident in her youth, when a housekeeper in her own village had been dismissed for reading a letter that revealed an inheritance dispute. The parallels were striking, though she cautioned herself against jumping to conclusions. The grocer's shop was her next stop, a small establishment where Mr. Bailey presided over sacks of flour and tins of biscuits with the air of a benevolent dictator. Tom Reed was there, stacking jars of marmalade, his lanky frame bent over the counter. Miss Marple approached with her usual disarming smile, a peppermint produced from her handbag like a conjurer's trick. "Good afternoon, Tom," she said. "I hear you've been busy with deliveries to Rose Cottage. Mrs. Finch was always so kind to you, wasn't she?" Tom flushed, his freckles stark against his reddening cheeks. "She was, miss. Gave me tea and a biscuit sometimes. But she's gone now, hasn't she? Folks are saying she was stealing, but I don't believe it. She was proper upset lately, always asking if I'd seen anyone odd about the village strangers, or folks acting queer. Never said why, though." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "How curious. And did you notice anything unusual yourself, Tom? You're out and about so much. You must see all sorts." Tom hesitated, his hand pausing on a jar. "Well, there's that artist, Mr. Redding. Seen him near Rose Cottage a few times, sketching. Once at dusk, which seemed odd hardly any light to draw by. Mrs. Finch asked me about him special, like she was worried he was up to something." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind alight with possibilities. Lawrence Redding, the charming newcomer, sketching in the twilight hardly the behavior of a mere artist. And Mrs. Finch's questions suggested she sensed a threat. As Miss Marple stepped back into the fading light of Chipping Barrows, she felt the threads of the mystery tightening. Rose Cottage held secrets, and she was determined to draw them into the open, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 3. The Grocer's Boy. The high street of Chipping Barrows shimmered under a thin veil of morning mist, the kind that clung to the cobblestones and softened the outlines of the village shops. Miss Jane Marple, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, walked with the purposeful air of someone running a trivial errand, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. The flutter of a curtain in Mrs. Phipps's bakery, the hurried step of the postman, the way the milkman's horse flicked its tail, as if sensing the village's unease. The dismissal of Mrs. Finch from Rose Cottage had stirred chipping barrows like a stone dropped in a still pond, and Miss Marple, with her quiet curiosity, was determined to trace the ripples to their source. Her destination was Bailey's grocer, a squat building with a green awning and windows crowded with tins of tea and jars of boiled sweets. Inside, the air smelled of flour and molasses, and the counter was a fortress of neatly stacked goods. Tom Reed, the grocer's boy, was sweeping the floor, his lanky frame moving with the awkward energy of youth. His freckled face brightened at the sight of Miss Marple, though a flicker of wariness crossed his eyes as she approached, her smile as disarming as ever. "Good morning, Tom," she said, her voice warm as she produced a peppermint from her handbag, offering it with the air of a kindly aunt. "You're looking busy as always. I suppose deliveries keep you on your toes, especially to places like Rose Cottage." Tom took the sweet, his fingers fumbling slightly as he pocketed it. "Morning, Miss Marple," he mumbled, leaning on his broom. I've been to Rose Cottage plenty, though not since. Well, you know, Mrs. Finch being sacked and all." His voice held a note of indignation, and Miss Marple noted the loyalty it betrayed. "Such a pity," she said, adjusting her spectacles as if the matter were of little consequence. "Mrs. Finch always seemed so reliable. I hear you two got on well tea and biscuits during your deliveries, wasn't it? She must have trusted you, Tom, to chat so freely." Tom's cheeks reddened, and he glanced toward the back of the shop where Mr. Bailey was tallying accounts. "She was kind, miss," he said, lowering his voice. "Always had a cuppa ready when I brought the groceries. We'd talk a bit, nothing much, just village goings-on. But these last few weeks, she was different. Jumpy, like. Kept asking me if I'd seen anyone strange hanging about, or if folks were acting out of sorts. Didn't say why, but I could tell she was worried." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest, though her expression remained one of mild concern. "Strange, you say? That's most curious. And did you notice anything unusual, Tom? You see so much of the village on your rounds." Tom hesitated, his broom tapping the floor as if to steady his thoughts. "Well, there was that new fellow, Mr. Redding, the artist. Seen him a few times near Rose Cottage, sitting on the stile with his sketchbook. Once or twice at odd hours early morning, or near dusk when the light's no good for drawing. Mrs. Finch asked me about him special, like she thought he was watching the place. I told her he seemed harmless, just sketching flowers and such, but she didn't look convinced." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. Lawrence Redding, with his easy charm and painter's smock, had become a figure of interest in chipping barrows, his arrival sparking whispers among the village's more romantic souls. But sketching at dusk? That was no artist's habit, she thought, recalling a young man in her own village years ago who had posed as a poet while spying for a less poetic purpose. "And did Mrs. Finch say anything else about Mr. Redding?" she asked, her tone as light as a summer breeze. "Not much," Tom admitted, scratching his head. "Just that she didn't trust him, said he asked too many questions about Mrs. Carver's habits when she was home, who came to visit. I thought it was just her being nervy, but then she got sacked, and now folks are saying she was stealing. I don't believe it, Miss Marple. Mrs. Finch wasn't the sort. She was proper upset after that row with Mrs. Carver near tears, when I saw her last, heading to her cottage." Miss Marple's fingers tightened briefly on her umbrella, though her smile never wavered. "How distressing for her," she murmured. "And where is Mrs. Finch now, I wonder? Has anyone seen her since?" Tom shook his head. "Not that I've heard, miss. Her cottage is shut up tight, curtains drawn and all. Mr. Bailey says she didn't come for her usual order this week, which isn't like her." Some reckon she's left the village in shame, but I dunno. Doesn't seem right. The bell above the shop door jingled, signaling a customer's arrival, and Tom straightened, glancing nervously at Mr. Bailey, who was now peering over his ledger. Miss Marple took the hint, thanking Tom with a nod and a promise to stop by again. As she stepped back into the misty street, her thoughts were a whirl of connections. Mrs. Finch's unease, her questions about strangers, her focus on Lawrence Redding, it all pointed to something more than a simple falling out with her employer. And those letters Mrs. Carver had mentioned, so fiercely guarded, loomed large in Miss Marple's mind. Were they the cause of Mrs. Finch's dismissal, or a symptom of a deeper secret? As she passed the church, its spire piercing the mist, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a parallel from her past, a governess in her old village, who had been dismissed after discovering her employer's correspondence with a disreputable relative. The letters had revealed a financial scheme, and the governess's curiosity had cost her her place. Could something similar be at play here? Mrs. Carver's agitation, the drawn curtains, the shadow Miss Marple had glimpsed the previous evening, each was a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to discern. She paused by the lych gate, her eyes scanning the lane that led to Rose Cottage. The village seemed to hold its breath, the mist muffling sound and lending an air of secrecy to the morning. Miss Marple knew better than to act hastily. The truth, like a shy creature, would reveal itself only to those who watched and waited. For now, she would continue her quiet inquiries. Perhaps at the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement's sharp tongue might offer further clues. With a final glance toward Rose Cottage, its chimneys just visible through the haze, Miss Marple turned toward home, her umbrella tapping a steady rhythm, and her mind alight with the promise of unraveling Chipping Barrow's latest mystery. Chapter 4. A Shadow in the Lane. The dusk settled over Chipping Barrows like a soft gray shawl, the air cool and heavy with the scent of damp leaves and chimney smoke. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, took an evening stroll along the lane that skirted Rose Cottage. Her steps were unhurried, her umbrella tapping the ground as if she were merely an old lady enjoying the quiet of the village. But her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, were alert, scanning the hedgerows and the low stone walls for anything out of place. The village was still abuzz with the drama of Mrs. Finch's dismissal, and Miss Marple, with her knack for noticing what others overlooked, felt the mystery deepening like the twilight around her. Rose Cottage stood at the lane's end, its windows glowing faintly through drawn curtains, the garden a patchwork of shadows cast by the late-blooming chrysanthemums. As Miss Marple approached, she slowed, her gaze lingering on the cottage's facade. The events of the past days, Mrs. Carver's accusations, Mrs. Finch's sudden departure, Tom Reed's tales of her unease, had woven a web of suspicion, and Miss Marple was determined to find its center. She had chosen this hour deliberately, knowing that dusk often revealed what daylight concealed. A rustle in the hedge made her pause, her hand tightening on her umbrella. It was only a blackbird flitting into the undergrowth, but the sound sharpened her senses. She moved closer to the cottage, pretending to admire the garden while her ears strained for any hint of movement within. Then, as she passed the parlor window, she saw it a flicker of shadow behind the lace curtains, brief but unmistakable, as if someone had moved swiftly out of sight. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. Mrs. Carver lived alone now, with no housekeeper or maid to account for such a presence. A visitor, perhaps, or something less innocent. She lingered, adjusting her shawl with deliberate care, and listened. A faint creak came from within, the kind a floorboard makes under cautious steps. It was not the sound of Mrs. Carver, whose brisk tread Miss Marple had noted during her visit. This was stealthier, almost furtive. She considered knocking, but thought better of it. To act now might startle the quarry, and Miss Marple preferred to observe, to let the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. With a final glance at the window, she turned back toward the village, her mind racing. The next morning brought news that sent a fresh wave of whispers through Chipping Barrows. Mrs. Finch, it seemed, had vanished entirely. Her small cottage, a neat little dwelling near the church, stood empty, its door locked and curtains drawn. The postman reported no sign of her, and Mr. Bailey at the grocer's confirmed she had not collected her weekly order, a lapse unheard of for the meticulous housekeeper. Miss Marple, taking her morning tea in her drawing-room, listened as Lily relayed the news with wide-eyed excitement. "They're saying she's run off, Miss Marple," Lily said, setting the teapot down with a clatter. "Mrs. Phipps thinks she was stealing from Mrs. Carver and left in shame, but Mr. Clement at the vicarage says that's nonsense. He saw her at church last Sunday, looking ever so pale, and now she's gone without a trace. What do you make of it, miss?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "It's very curious, Lily," she said. "Mrs. Finch didn't strike me as the sort to run. She was upset, you say Tom Reed told us, and asking about strangers. Perhaps she felt unsafe." Her mind returned to the shadow in Rose Cottage, the creak of the floorboard. Could Mrs. Finch have returned secretly, or was someone else prowling the house? And what of Lawrence Redding, the artist Tom had mentioned, sketching at odd hours? The threads were tangling, but Miss Marple was patient, accustomed to unraveling such knots. She recalled a similar case from years ago, in a village not unlike Chipping Barrows, where a maid had disappeared after overhearing a conversation not meant for her ears. The maid had been found, eventually, hiding with a relative, frightened by threats from her employer's brother. Miss Marple wondered if Mrs. Finch's absence followed a similar pattern. Had she stumbled upon something in Mrs. Carver's letters, something worth fleeing over? The accusation of betrayal suggested a secret too dangerous to ignore. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement's sharp observations might shed light on Mrs. Finch's state of mind. As she walked through the village, the morning sun burned away the last of the mist, revealing Chipping Barrows in all its quiet charm. Yet Miss Marple felt the weight of unseen eyes, as if the village itself were watching, guarding its secrets. She passed the Blue Boar, where Lawrence Redding lodged, and noted the open window of his room, a sketchbook visible on the sill. Her curiosity about the artist deepened, but she filed it away for later. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement greeted her with a flurry of hospitality, though her eyes gleamed with the promise of gossip. Over tea and slightly dry scones, she confirmed what Lily had heard. "Mrs. Finch was at church last Sunday, looking like a ghost," Mrs. Clement said, leaning forward. "Kept glancing at the door, as if she expected someone to burst in. I asked if she was well, but she brushed me off, said it was nothing. And now she's gone." "It's most peculiar, Miss Marple. Did she mention anything unusual?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. "Anyone she was concerned about, perhaps?" Mrs. Clement's lips pursed, savoring the chance to share. "Well, she didn't say much, but I did hear her talking to Mrs. Phipps after the service. Something about that artist, Mr. Redding. He's been seen near Rose Cottage at all hours, you know, sketching, or so he claims. But who sketches in the dark? I wouldn't be surprised if he's mixed up in this somehow." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts circling back to the shadow in the lane. Redding's presence near Rose Cottage, combined with Mrs. Finch's questions about strangers, suggested he was more than a passing figure in this drama. She thanked Mrs. Clement and left the vicarage, her mind buzzing. The village seemed to close ranks around its secrets, but Miss Marple was undeterred. She would return to Rose Cottage, perhaps under another pretext, and keep watch. For now, the shadow behind the curtains lingered in her thoughts, a silent challenge to her unyielding curiosity. Chapter 5. The Vicar's Tea. The morning sun filtered through the leaded windows of the Chipping Barrows vicarage, casting a patchwork of light across the threadbare carpet of the drawing-room. Miss Jane Marple sat in a slightly sagging armchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes bright with quiet attentiveness. The vicarage, with its air of genteel shabbiness, was a hub of village life, where news flowed as freely as the weak tea served in shipped china cups. Miss Marple had come under the pretense of discussing the church flower Rhoda, but her true purpose was to glean what she could about Mrs. Finch's disappearance and the curious events at Rose Cottage. The vicar, Mr. Clement, a mild-mannered man with a perpetually distracted air, sat across from her, stirring his tea absent-mindedly. His wife, Mrs. Clement, was far more animated, her sharp eyes glinting with the relish of fresh gossip. "It's simply dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, passing a plate of biscuits that were just past their prime. "Mrs. Finch, gone without a trace. I saw her at church last Sunday, looking as if she'd seen a ghost, and now her cottage is empty. The whole village is talking about it." Miss Marple accepted a biscuit with a polite smile, though she had no intention of eating it. "Most unsettling," she murmured, her voice soft but encouraging. "You say she seemed distressed at church? Did she speak of anything troubling her?" Mrs. Clement leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, she was in a state, Miss Marple. Kept glancing at the door during the sermon, as if she expected someone to come bursting in. I tried to ask if she was all right, but she was evasive, said it was just a headache. But I overheard her talking to Mrs. Phipps afterward, and she mentioned something about strangers in the village. She seemed particularly worried about that artist, Mr. Lawrence Redding." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained one of mild curiosity. "Mr. Redding, you say? I've heard he's been seen near Rose Cottage, sketching at odd hours." "How very peculiar." Mrs. Clement nodded vigorously, her curls bouncing. "Exactly. Who sketches in the twilight, I ask you? I saw him myself one evening, sitting on the stile near Rose Cottage with his sketchbook, though it was near dark. And Mrs. Phipps says he's been asking questions about Mrs. Carver when she's at home. Who visits? It's not the behavior of an ordinary artist, if you ask me." Mr. Clement, roused from his reverie, cleared his throat. "Now, my dear, we mustn't jump to conclusions. Mr. Redding seems a pleasant enough fellow, and artists are often eccentric. Perhaps he's simply inspired by the cottages. Atmosphere." His voice trailed off, as if he himself were unconvinced, and he returned to stirring his tea. Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. Mrs. Finch's unease, her questions about strangers, and now her disappearance suggested she had uncovered something perhaps in those letters Mrs. Carver had accused her of reading. And Lawrence Redding, with his late-night sketching and prying questions, was emerging as a figure of increasing significance. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth, when a so-called botanist in her village had turned out to be a debt collector in disguise, snooping for a creditor. Could Redding be playing a similar role, hiding his true purpose behind an artist's facade? Did Mrs. Finch mention anything specific about Mr. Redding? Miss Marple asked, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. Or perhaps about Mrs. Carver's household? Mrs. Clement pursed her lips, savoring the chance to share more. Not directly, but she did say something odd to Mrs. Phipps about letters. Said she'd seen something she wasn't meant to, though she wouldn't elaborate. I thought it was just housekeeper's gossip at the time, but now, with her gone, well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the implications. Letters, again those private papers Mrs. Carver had been so protective of. Had Mrs. Finch stumbled upon a secret that made her a threat? And was Redding connected to it, watching Rose Cottage for reasons beyond art? She sipped her tea, which was predictably tepid, and steered the conversation to safer ground, complimenting the vicarage roses to avoid arousing suspicion. As she left the vicarage, the village was settling into its midday rhythm. The clatter of a delivery cart, the laughter of children playing near the green, the distant chime of the church clock. Yet Miss Marple felt the undercurrent of unease that had settled over Chipping Barrows. Mrs. Finch's disappearance was no simple flight of shame, she was certain. The shadow she had seen behind Rose Cottage's curtains, the creak of a floorboard in a supposedly empty house. These were clues to a deeper disturbance. And Redding's presence, like a discordant note in a familiar tune, demanded closer scrutiny. She resolved to visit the Blue Boar, where Redding lodged, to observe him firsthand. Artists, she knew, were often observant themselves, and she would need to tread carefully. As she passed Rose Cottage on her way home, she noted the curtains still drawn, the garden silent save for the rustle of leaves. The house seemed to watch her in return, its windows like eyes guarding a secret. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a long-ago incident in another village, where a housemaid had vanished after discovering her employer's plans to rewrite a will. The parallels were striking, though she cautioned herself against assuming too much. Back in her drawing room, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as a cover for her racing thoughts. The village of Chipping Barrows, with its quaint cottages and whispering lanes, was a stage for something more sinister than a housekeeper's dismissal. Mrs. Finch, Redding, those letters, and the shadow in the lane were all pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. For now, she would visit the Blue Boar, perhaps under the guise of inquiring about a painting for her nephew Raymond. With a quiet smile, she picked up her needles, the click of their rhythm a counterpoint to the questions swirling in her mind. Chapter 6. The Artist's Secret. The Blue Boar, Chipping Barrows' only inn, stood at the heart of the village, its timber-bird facade and swinging sign a familiar landmark for locals and travelers alike. Its low-ceilinged tap-room buzzed with the murmur of farmers and shopkeepers. But Miss Jane Marple's interest lay upstairs, where Lawrence Redding, the enigmatic artist, had taken lodgings. She approached the inn with her usual unassuming air, a basket over her arm containing a skein of wool she claimed to need advice on for a painting project for her nephew Raymond. The pretext was flimsy, but Miss Marple knew the power of a gentle, elderly demeanor to disarm suspicion. The inn's staircase creaked under her careful steps, and she knocked softly on the door marked Room 3. Lawrence Redding opened it, his dark eyes narrowing briefly before a charming smile spread across his face. He was a handsome man, perhaps 30, with a lean build and hair that fell artfully over his brow, dressed in a smock streaked with paint. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm but tinged with caution. "What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the visit?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, Mr. Redding, I hope I'm not intruding. I've heard such praise for your sketches, and I thought you might advise me on a little project something for my nephew. You see," she gestured vaguely with her basket, her gaze already sweeping the room. It was a cluttered space, filled with the sharp scent of turpentine and linseed oil. Canvases leaned against the walls, some half-finished, depicting village scenes. The church spire, the green, and prominently, Rose Cottage, its chrysanthemums rendered in vivid strokes. A rickety table held pencils, brushes, and a sketchbook, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a smaller drawing, half hidden beneath others. It showed the back door of Rose Cottage, complete with precise measurements of the frame and lock, as if drawn for more than artistic purposes. "Please, do come in," Redding said, stepping aside with a flourish that did not quite mask his unease. He gestured to a chair, but Miss Marple remained standing, her eyes roving as if admiring his work. "You're interested in painting, then?" he asked, his tone light but probing. "Oh, not myself," she said, her voice airy. "But I do admire skill, and your sketches are so detailed. This one of Rose Cottage, for instance, quite remarkable. You must spend a great deal of time there to capture it so well." Her gaze lingered on the measured drawing, and she noted the slight tightening of Redding's jaw. He laughed, a touch too loudly, and moved to cover the sketch with another. "An artist's obsession, Miss Marple. The cottage has a certain charm, especially in the evening light. I find myself drawn to it." He turned, busying himself with a paintbrush, but Miss Marple caught the way his hand strayed toward a small, locked drawer in the table. "How interesting," she said, her tone as mild as milk. "Though I've heard you've been seen there at rather odd hours dusk, or even later. The light can't be very good, then, surely?" Her question hung in the air, innocent but pointed, as she watched his reaction closely. Redding's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "An artist's whims, you know. Sometimes the mood strikes when the light is unconventional." He gestured to a canvas of Rose Cottage bathed in twilight, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, recalling a young man in her old village who had posed as a surveyor while plotting a burglary. Redding's sketches, especially that detailed drawing of the door, suggested a purpose beyond art. She nodded, as if satisfied, and turned the conversation to safer ground, asking about his technique and praising his use of color. But her eyes missed nothing. The locked drawer, the nervous way Redding's fingers tapped the table, the faint smudge of ink on his cuff, as if he'd been writing rather than painting. She made a mental note to inquire further about his background, perhaps through the innkeeper, who was known to be talkative after a pint. As she prepared to leave, Redding's charm returned, though it felt strained. "Do let me know if your nephew needs a sketch, Miss Marple," he said, escorting her to the door. "I'd be happy to oblige." "You're too kind," she replied, her smile serene, but her mind alight with suspicion. As she descended the creaking stairs, she heard the faint click of a lock behind her. Redding securing that drawer, no doubt. The artist was hiding something, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. That evening, as she sat in her drawing room, knitting forgotten in her lap, the village was shaken by a new shock. A scream had pierced the quiet of Chipping Barrows, shrill and unmistakable, coming from Rose Cottage. By morning, the news was everywhere. Mrs. Evelyn Carver had been found unconscious in her garden, a gash on her forehead, her nightdress tangled in the rose bushes. The doctor, summoned hastily, declared it an accident. She had tripped, perhaps, or fainted, but Miss Marple, hearing the news from an agitated Lily, was not convinced. "An accident, they say," Lily exclaimed, her hands fluttering as she poured tea. "But Mrs. Phipps says she heard that scream, and it wasn't the sound of someone tripping, Miss Marple. It was fear, she says, pure fear." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts racing. The shadow she had seen behind Rose Cottage's curtains, the creak of a floorboard, Redding's suspicious sketches, and now this attack on Mrs. Carver, it all pointed to a pattern, one she was beginning to discern. She recalled a case from years ago, where a woman had been struck to silence, a secret she threatened to reveal. Was Mrs. Carver a victim of a similar scheme? And where was Mrs. Finch, whose disappearance seemed tied to the same thread? She resolved to return to Rose Cottage, perhaps to offer condolences, and to keep a closer eye on Lawrence Redding. The artist's secret, whatever it was, lay at the heart of this mystery, and Miss Marple's quiet persistence would draw it into the light. For now, she picked up her knitting, the click of her needles a steady counterpoint to the questions swirling in her mind as Chipping Barrows settled into an uneasy night. Chapter 7. The Unraveled Thread. The morning mist had lifted from Chipping Barrows, leaving the village bathed in a pale autumnal light that did little to dispel the unease hanging over its lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden at Lavender Cottage, a shawl about her shoulders, her knitting abandoned on the wrought-iron table beside her. The events of the past days, Mrs. Finch's dismissal and disappearance, the shadow behind Rose Cottage's curtains, Lawrence Redding's suspicious sketches, and now Mrs. Carver's alarming accident had woven a tapestry of intrigue that demanded her full attention. Her sharp mind, accustomed to untangling the knots of human behavior, was piecing together the threads, and she sensed the pattern was close to revealing itself. Mrs. Carver's misfortune had sent fresh ripples through the village. The doctor's verdict of a fall was accepted by most, but Miss Marple, with her keen memory of similar incidents, suspected more. A gash on the forehead, a scream of fear rather than surprise, These were not the hallmarks of a mere stumble. She recalled a case from her youth, where a woman had been struck to silence her knowledge of a forged document. Could Mrs. Carver have been targeted for what she knew, perhaps tied to those fiercely guarded letters? And where did Lawrence Redding, with his furtive sketches and locked drawer, fit into this? Determined to probe further, Miss Marple decided to visit Rose Cottage again, this time under the guise of offering condolences for Mrs. Carver's mishap. She chose a basket of apples from her garden as her pretext, their polished red skins gleaming as she set out along the high street. The village was subdued, its usual chatter muted by the weight of recent events. As she passed the Blue Boar, she noted the curtains of Lawrence Redding's room were drawn, though a faint light flickered within, suggesting he was awake despite the early hour. At Rose Cottage, Mrs. Carver received her in the parlor, her face pale beneath a bandage on her forehead. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly, the pearl brooch at her collar glinting in the dim light. The room felt colder than before, the fire unlit, and the curtains remained drawn, casting long shadows across the furniture. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Carver said, her voice strained but polite, "you're very kind to call. I'm afraid I'm not myself after my fall." Miss Marple set the basket of apples on the table, her eyes gentle but observant. "My dear Mrs. Carver, I was so distressed to hear of your accident. A fall in the garden, how dreadful. I do hope you're recovering?" Mrs. Carver's lips twitched, as if the word accident carried a bitter taste. "The doctor says I'll be fine," she replied, her fingers twisting the brooch. "I must have tripped on a root or some such thing. It's all a blur, really." Her gaze darted to the window, and Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, as if she feared something beyond the curtains. "How fortunate you weren't more seriously hurt," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "It must be difficult, being alone here now, with Mrs. Finch gone. Such a shock, her leaving so suddenly." Mrs. Carver's eyes narrowed, a spark of her old fire returning. "She betrayed my trust, Miss Marple, prying into my private affairs letters that were none of her business. I had no choice but to dismiss her." Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with something closer to fear, and Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. "Those letters," she ventured, her voice as soft as a whisper. "They must have been very personal to cause such a rift. Not family matters, perhaps?" It was a delicate probe, but Miss Marple's gentle demeanor made it seem almost incidental. Mrs. Carver froze, her hand gripping the brooch until her knuckles whitened. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the distant tick of a clock. Then, as if the weight of secrecy became too much, she spoke, her voice low and halting. "They were from my late husband's brother, Edward," she confessed. "He's been writing, demanding money, claiming he's entitled to half the estate. I thought no one knew, but Mrs. Finch. She must have read them. I couldn't risk her spreading such things." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Edward Carver, a name whispered in the village years ago as a ne'er-do-well who had left England under a cloud. His return, even through letters, was a revelation. And suddenly, Lawrence Redding's presence, his sketches of Rose Cottage, his questions about Mrs. Carver's habits, took on a new significance. Could he be Edward himself, hiding behind the guise of an artist to press his claim? The locked drawer, the measured drawing of the cottage door, it all pointed to a scheme more calculated than mere artistry. She murmured sympathies, steering the conversation to lighter topics to avoid alarming Mrs. Carver. As she left, her mind was ablaze. Redding's behavior, Mrs. Finch's fear, the letters, and now the attack on Mrs. Carver formed a pattern as clear as the stitches in her knitting. She recalled a similar case, where a man had posed as a distant cousin to infiltrate a household, only to be unmasked by a careful observer. Redding, she suspected, was no artist but Edward Carver, watching Rose Cottage for his own ends. Back in her drawing room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched as she considered her next move. She would need evidence to confirm her suspicions, perhaps from that locked drawer in Redding's room. The village, with its quiet lanes and watchful eyes, held its breath, and Miss Marple knew she must act with care. A visit to the Blue Boar, perhaps with the constable's assistance, would be her next step. For now, she gazed out at Chipping Barrows, where the shadows of secrets lingered behind every cottage curtain, waiting for her to draw them into the light. Chapter 8. The Curtain Falls. The pale October light filtered the lace curtains of Lavender Cottage, casting delicate patterns across Miss Jane Marple's drawing room. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, her knitting needles silent for once. The events at Rose Cottage had reached a crescendo, and Miss Marple's sharp mind had pieced together the final threads of the mystery. Mrs. Carver's confession about the letters from Edward, her late husband's brother, had confirmed her suspicions about Lawrence Redding. His sketches, his nocturnal visits to Rose Cottage, and the locked drawer in his room at the Blue Boar pointed to a scheme far darker than village gossip. Mrs. Finch's disappearance and Mrs. Carver's attack were no mere accidents, and Miss Marple knew the time for quiet observation was over. She had shared her suspicions with Constable Harris, a steady young man with more sense than most gave him credit for. Though initially skeptical of an old lady's theories, he had listened as she outlined the connections. Mrs. Finch's discovery of the letters, her fear of a stranger watching the cottage, Redding's detailed drawings of the house's entry points, and the attack on Mrs. Carver to silence her. "It's a delicate matter, Constable," Miss Marple had said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I believe Mr. Redding may be Edward Carver, returned to claim what he thinks is his due. A search of his room might prove illuminating." That afternoon, under the guise of a routine inquiry about a minor theft in the village, Constable Harris accompanied Miss Marple to the Blue Boar. The innkeeper, Mr. Grayson, was only too happy to assist, his curiosity piqued by the constable's presence. Redding was out, sketching in the meadows, or so he'd claimed, and Miss Marple stood quietly by as Harris, with Mr. Grayson's permission, unlocked the door to room 3. The room was as she remembered, canvases stacked against the walls, the air sharp with turpentine, and the small table cluttered with art supplies. Her eyes went straight to the locked drawer, and with a nod from her, Harris produced a small tool and set to work. The drawer yielded its secrets with a soft click. Inside were no artist's tools, but a bundle of letters, tied with string, and a folded document that made Harris's eyes widen. "Miss Marple," he said, holding it up, "this looks like a will, and it's got Mrs. Carver's name on it." The letters, as Miss Marple had suspected, were from Edward Carver to his sister-in-law, demanding a share of the estate and hinting at legal action. The will, however, was a forgery, naming Edward as sole heir, and dated after Mr. Carver's death, a clumsy attempt to secure the inheritance by deceit. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her thoughts confirmed. "I believe, Constable," she said, "that Mr. Redding is Edward Carver himself, posing as an artist to spy on Mrs. Carver and press his claim. Poor Mrs. Finch must have seen these letters and realized his intent. That's why she was so frightened and why she fled." Harris nodded, his face grim. "And the attack on Mrs. Carver? You think he did that too?" "Almost certainly," Miss Marple replied. She suspected something after Mrs. Finch's discovery, and he couldn't risk her exposing him. A desperate act, but not a clever one. She recalled a similar case in her old village, where a man had forged a will to claim a family fortune, only to be undone by a housekeeper's sharp eyes. History, it seemed, had a way of repeating itself. The constable arranged for Redding to be brought in upon his return, and Miss Marple suggested a discreet inquiry into Mrs. Finch's whereabouts. A telegram to a cousin in the neighboring village of Lower Wickham revealed the truth. Mrs. Finch, fearing for her safety after confronting Redding about the letters, had taken refuge there, too frightened to return. She had seen Redding lurking near Rose Cottage one night, and when she found the forged will among Mrs. Carver's papers, she knew he was planning something sinister. Her dismissal had been the final straw, driving her to flee rather than risk further harm. That evening, Redding was confronted at the Blue Boar. Faced with the letters, the forged will, and Mrs. Finch's testimony relayed by telegram, he crumbled. "I only wanted what was mine," he muttered, his charm replaced by sullen defiance. Evelyn had no right to it all. "I thought if I could scare her, she'd pay up." He admitted to striking Mrs. Carver in a panic when she caught him searching her desk for more evidence to bolster his claim. As Harris led him away, Redding cast a bitter glance at Miss Marple, muttering about meddling old women, but she only smiled, her composure unruffled. Mrs. Finch returned to Chipping Barrows the next day, pale but relieved, and was reinstated at Rose Cottage after a tearful reconciliation with Mrs. Carver, who admitted her haste in dismissing her loyal housekeeper. The village, true to form, buzzed with the tale, though Miss Marple avoided the limelight, content to let Constable Harris take the credit. Back in her drawing room, she sipped her tea, the familiar click of her knitting needles resuming. "People are so careless," she murmured to Lily, who was clearing the tray. "They think their secrets are safe behind curtains, but there's always someone watching, someone who notices." Lily nodded, only half understanding, and Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she gazed out at the village, where the cottages stood serene once more, their secrets laid bare by her quiet, relentless curiosity.